expression present material aggregate. 5. In the expression present material aggregate. In whichever order you use the two terms. If no distinction is made between each. If they are used as identical. Of one import. As the same. As of the same content and origin, then when you say, that present material aggregate, on ceasing, gives up its present state, you must also admit that material aggregate gives up its materiality. Similarly, when you say, that present material aggregate on ceasing does not give up its materiality, you must also admit that it does not give up its presence. 6. Theravadin. But in the expression white cloth. In whichever order you use the terms. If no distinction is made between each. If they are used as identical. Of one import, as the same, as one in content and origin, then when you say white cloth when it is being dyed loses its whiteness, you must also admit it loses its clothness. Again. In the expression white cloth. In whichever order you use the terms. If no distinction is made between each. If they are used as aforesaid, then when you say white cloth when it is being dyed does not give up its clothness, you must also admit that it does not give up its whiteness. 7. Theravadin. If you assert that the material aggregate retains its materiality, you must admit that the material aggregate is permanent, persistent, eternal, not subject to change. You know that the opposite is true. Hence it should not be said that materiality is retained. 8. Nibbana does not abandon its state as nibbana. By this we mean nibbana is permanent, persistent, eternal, not subject to change. And you ought to mean this, too, in the case of material aggregate, if you say that the latter does not abandon its materiality. Do you mean by material aggregate does not abandon its materiality, that the aggregate is impermanent, non-persistent, temporary, subject to change? You assent. Well, then, you should affirm the same with regard to nibbana when you say, nibbana does not abandon its state as nibbana. 9. If, in your statement the past exists, you mean it retains its pastness or preterition, then in your statement the future exists you ought to mean it retains its futurity, and in your statement the present exists, you ought to mean it retains its presentness, or presence. 10. Each of these affirmations involves a similar affirmation respecting the other two divisions of time. 11. If the past exists and retains its preterition, then must it be permanent, persistent, eternal, not subject to change. And this, you admit, is not right. When you say nibbana exists, and retains its state as nibbana, you mean it is permanent and so on. So much also must you mean if you predicate the same respecting the past. Or, if you do not mean that the past is permanent and so on, when you say it exists and retains its preterition, then when you say this of nibbana, you imply that nibbana is impermanent and so on. 13-20. All the foregoing applies equally to the particular past, future, and present things called the five aggregates, e.g. If, in your statement past consciousness exists, you mean it retains its preterition, then, in your statement future consciousness exists, you must mean such consciousness retains its futurity. Also, in your statement present consciousness exists, you must mean such consciousness retains its presence. And each of these affirmations involves a similar affirmation respecting the other two divisions of time. Again, if past consciousness exists and retains its preterition, then must it be permanent, persistent, eternal, not subject to change, and this you admit is not right. When you say nibbana exists and retains its state as nibbana, you mean it is permanent and so on. So much also must you mean, if you predicate the same respecting past consciousness. Or, if you do not mean that past consciousness is permanent and so on. When you say it exists and retains its preterition, then when you say this of nibbana, you imply that nibbana is impermanent, not persistent, temporary, subject to change. 21. Is the past a non-existent thing? If you say yes, you must reject your view that the past exists. If you say the non-past exists, then to say there exists a past, is equally wrong. Again, is the future a non-existent thing? If you say yes, you must reject your view that the future exists. If you say the non-future alone exists, then to say there exists the future, is equally wrong. 22. Does that which has been future become present? If you assent, you must admit that that which was future is the same as that which is now present. You admit this? Then you must admit that anything which having been future, is present, will in turn, having been future, become once more present. You admit this? Then you must also admit that that which, not having been future, is not present, will not in turn have been future only to become present again. This series of dilemmas is also applicable to present and past, thus. Does that which has been present become past? If so, you must admit that that which was present is the same as that which is past. If you do admit this, you must also admit that anything which having been present, is past will in turn have been present only to become past once more. If you do admit this, you must also admit it as true for their contradictories. Similarly for future, present, past. Does the future, having been, become present, and the present, having been, become past? If so, you must admit that these three are identical, and that the process of becoming the one after having been the other is repeated. If you do admit this, you must admit it as true for their contradictories. Applications of the Purged Time-Ideas. 23. Theravadin. Do all the conditions of an act of visual perception. I. Visible objects, visual consciousness, light, attention, when past, exist. If you say yes, you should also admit that one sees the object that is past with an eye that is past. Similarly, for all the conditions of all other varieties of sense perception that are past, to wit, ear, audible objects, auditory consciousness, space, attention. The nose, odors, olfactory consciousness, air, attention. The tongue, sapid objects, sapid consciousness, liquid, attention. Body, touches, body consciousness, extensity, attention. Mind, objects of consciousness, reflection, the seat of mental activity, attention. For instance, taking the last. You should then also admit that one perceives the past object of consciousness with the past mind. 24. Similarly, if the conditions of a future act of sense perception exist, e.g., I, visible objects, visual consciousness, light, attention, then one should see future object with future eye, and so on. 25. For if you say that the conditions of present visual and other perception exist, and that you see present objects with an eye, etc., that is present, so, if you maintain that the past conditions of sense perception exist, must you say that with the past eye one sees past objects, etc. 26. And similarly for future conditions of sense perception.